In the 1980s, one man terrorized the streets of Los Angeles with a string of brutal and sadistic crimes. His name was Richard Ramirez, but the world would come to know him as the Night Stalker. Ramirez was responsible for a series of home invasions, murders, and sexual assaults that shook the city to its core. His random, violent attacks left a community living in fear and police struggling to find a pattern. Richard Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. His early life was marked by trauma and violence. He suffered abuse at the hands of his father, and his older cousin Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran, exposed him to horrific images of war, torture, and death. Miguel even bragged to a young Ramirez about committing violent acts during his time in Vietnam, showing him gruesome photos of his victims. This left a deep, lasting impression on Ramirez. At the age of 13, Richard witnessed Miguel murder his own wife, right in front of him. This event would be a turning point in Ramirez's life, pushing him further down a dark path of violence and depravity. After this traumatic event, Ramirez dropped out of school and began experimenting with drugs, further distancing himself from any chance of a normal life. In the early 1980s, Richard Ramirez moved to Los Angeles, where his reign of terror began. Starting in 1984, Ramirez embarked on a killing spree that spanned more than a year. His victims ranged from elderly women to young couples, making him unpredictable and even more terrifying. Ramirez's method was chilling. He would break into homes late at night, often while the occupants were asleep, and brutally attack them. His crimes included shootings, stabbings, beatings, and sexual assaults. He would often leave satanic symbols, like pentagrams, at the crime scenes, further fueling the media frenzy that surrounded his killings. Ramirez's murders were particularly shocking because of their randomness. There was no clear pattern in his choice of victims, and his attacks seemed to be driven by opportunity and impulse. He would kill, sexually assault, or both, depending on what seemed to satisfy his dark urges in the moment. His victims came from all walks of life, and the randomness of his attacks made the people of Los Angeles live in constant fear, unsure of when or where he would strike next. As the body count grew, so did the public's panic. Ramirez's crimes were not limited to murder. He often tortured his victims, forcing them to swear allegiance to Satan before killing them. His obsession with Satanism became a key part of his identity, and he would sometimes spare victims after making them swear loyalty to Satan. These details only added to the Night Stalker's terrifying image in the media. Despite the growing number of victims, Ramirez was able to evade capture for over a year. The police were overwhelmed by the brutality and randomness of his crimes. There seemed to be no way to predict his next move. However, in August 1985, things began to unravel for Ramirez. During one of his home invasions, he was spotted by a neighbor who managed to get a partial license plate number. This crucial piece of evidence, combined with a fingerprint left at one of the crime scenes, led the police to finally identify him. On August 30th, 1985, Ramirez was recognized on the street by a group of citizens in East Los Angeles. Realizing he had been caught, Ramirez tried to flee, but the crowd chased him down, beating him until the police arrived. After more than a year of terror, the Night Stalker was finally in custody. During his trial, Richard Ramirez showed no remorse. He often mocked the victims' families and declared his devotion to Satan. At one point, he famously turned to the courtroom cameras and said, "Hail Satan." His cold, emotionless demeanor shocked the public, and the media circus surrounding the trial only added to his notoriety. In 1989, Ramirez was convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. He was sentenced to death. As the verdict was read, Ramirez showed no signs of fear or regret. Instead, he responded by saying, "Big deal. Death always comes with the territory. I'll see you in Disneyland." For decades, Richard Ramirez sat on death row, becoming a dark legend in American crime history. He never expressed remorse for his actions, and his name remains synonymous with evil. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died of complications related to B-cell lymphoma while still awaiting execution. The story of the Night Stalker is one of brutality, fear, and an unrelenting descent into madness. Richard Ramirez's horrific crimes left a permanent scar on the city of Los Angeles, and his legacy as one of the most terrifying serial killers in American history will not be forgotten.